Roane County, Tennessee, the 27th of December, 2008. Under the gray is a field, a road, and part of a river. 5 days earlier, a dike had given way at the Kingston fossil plant. TVA's own Inspector General described the timing in 6 words. Just hours after the last daily inspection, somebody had been walking that dike every day. The reason was written down in 1985, and by 2008, almost nobody at TVA seems to have known what it was. This is about that memo, and about who was permitted to look at it afterward. Between midnight and 1 in the morning on the 22nd of December, an ash pond dike broke. 5.4 million cubic yards of coal ash sludge went across 300 acres of Watts Bar Reservoir. Swan Pond Creek embayment, the lower Emery River, the shoreline. 8 of those acres were private property. 3 homes destroyed, 23 damaged, plus the roads, the rail line, and the utilities. Nobody was killed and nobody was hurt. Worth saying plainly because very little else here is good news. At 12:40 in the morning, a man trapped in his house by the sludge called 911. The shift supervisor drove out and found the dike on cell number 2 collapsed. TVA put the cost at between $675 million and $975 million, not counting litigation, claims, remediation, monitoring, or fines. So how does a 50-year-old dike fail without warning? It doesn't. On the 3rd of April, 1985, TVA's Director of Engineering Projects wrote to TVA's Director of Fossil and Hydro Power. Subject, Kingston Steam Plant, Dike C, Soils Investigation and Engineering Study Results. Dike C had not been built to the design drawings. The factor of safety it was actually built to, how much stronger a structure is than the load it carries, was less than desirable. The memo recommended that plant personnel inspect Dike C daily. The calculated factor of safety was less than the minimum acceptable value of 1.5. And close monitoring was recommended, in lieu of changing TVA policies and procedures that would require the ash pond to be designed to the higher dam safety standard. The daily inspection was not a precaution on top of a fix. It was instead of the fix, and they kept stacking ash on it. The original perimeter dike crested near 748 feet. The cell that failed crested near 820. 70 feet above the structure the 1985 memo was worried about. In 2004, TVA wanted to go higher still and hired Worley Parsons to run a slope stability analysis for the expansion. Parsons found a layer of loose ash, 7 to 10 feet thick, lying straight on the clay beneath the pond, and reported it might liquefy. It called that extremely low probability. Then it noted that the methods for predicting liquefaction have proven to be insufficient and recommended TVA improve the pond's drainage. The Inspector General asked whether the drainage was ever installed. We learned that it had not. TVA had doubts about the Parsons study and hired Geosyntec to peer review it. Geosyntec reported that November. Nobody had estimated whether that ash layer would liquefy, so nobody could say whether the drains were needed or whether they would have worked. The potential for liquefaction should be estimated. If the site is expected to liquefy, then ground improvement techniques need to be implemented. Those recommendations were not followed either. The chief executive told the Inspector General he had noticed how significant the study was and had asked internally why nothing was done. According to the CEO, he was unable to ascertain why. One more piece, and it involves the state. In June of 2004, TVA applied to Tennessee's Environment Department to raise the pond. Approved September 2006, TVA gave the state the Parsons study. The state was unable to find documentation that the Geosyntec study, the peer review, the one that said estimate the liquefaction, was ever provided to it. The permit required TVA to hand over anything it later realized it had left out. where the permittee becomes aware that it failed to submit any relevant facts in a permit application, it shall promptly submit such facts or information. The engineer who read all of this for the Inspector General reached a conclusion the report said in italics and underlined. Had corrective measures been taken in a timely fashion, it is possible that TVA could have potentially prevented the occurrence of the failure. On the 8th of January 2009, TVA's chief executive testified before a Senate committee. The senators wanted to know what caused the spill and which decisions inside TVA contributed to it. A root cause analysis would answer that. The chief executive handed the job of arranging it to TVA's Office of General Counsel, the lawyers, and told them the firm should be one of the best. The lawyers chose AECOM. The lawyers also wrote the scope. The Office of General Counsel, by contract and verbal instruction, severely limited the scope of the work of AECOM. 4 things the investigator was told not to look at. 1. The standard of practice used to design and build the ash ponds. 2. Where the ash and its contaminants went. 3. How to clean the site up. 4. The design and operation of every other wet ash pond TVA owned. On the 25th of June 2009, TVA held a press conference. The cause was a thin buried layer of soft silt and what the engineers called slimes. A reporter asked whether anything in the old stability analyses should have raised a red flag at the time. We had to look at the facts that were in front of us. And those signs simply were not identified in those, and it took us 2.5 months to find that. So I guess it's lessons learned to move forward. Hindsight is 20/20. Let's take the lessons learned and move forward. To be fair to the engineer at that podium, and the report is careful to be, it found no evidence anyone tried to influence his work, and calls him a consummate professional. The criticism is not of the man. It is of the boundary drawn around him. That boundary had a shape, and the shape was useful. If the cause was a freak layer unique to Kingston, TVA could not reasonably have found it. Need not change anything, and no other ash pond in the country was implicated. The report lays out the choice the agency faced. One option was to examine the failed structure and its own management and publish whatever turned up. The second choice was to circle the wagons, carefully craft press releases to project TVA in the most favorable light, and to tightly control any reports done by TVA of the failure to minimize legal liability. Then he says which one they took. TVA management handled the root cause analysis in a manner that avoided transparency and accountability in favor of preserving a litigation strategy. A federal inspector general writing about his own agency in a report addressed to his own chief executive. He also explains how a utility ends up with a 50-year-old dam inspected by people who do not think of it as a dam. Ash was relegated to the status of garbage at a landfill rather than treating it as a potential hazard to the public and the environment. Then the report does something unusual. It writes out the sentences TVA should have said and hadn't. Building the original ash pond over a lake bed was a faulty design. Corrective actions recommended by employees and consultants should have been implemented. Stacking ash to the heights contemplated at Kingston was a bad idea. And the 6th, wet ash ponds should comply with dam safety standards rather than with landfill standards. The report went to the TVA board on the 14th of July, 2009. A week later, at a specially called meeting, management publicly acknowledged many of the failures it identified. The Inspector General wrote a footnote applauding them for it. The cover memo carries one more instruction. This report will not be released to the public before 10 a.m., July 28, 2009. Therefore, please do not distribute this report without prior approval of the Inspector General. 5 days in which the findings existed and the public did not have them. In April of 2015, the Environmental Protection Agency published the first federal rule governing coal ash disposal, nearly 200 pages of the Federal Register. Kingston is in the text. The rule says the failure there was at least partly attributable to slip plane failure of saturated coal ash in the subgrade, and makes unstable man-made ground a prohibited location for a new unit. The agency worked out what an ash embankment has to withstand and found that a post-liquefaction residual strength factor of safety in the embankment of 1.00 is not sufficient. So it put numbers in the Code of Federal Regulations. The calculated static factor of safety under the long-term maximum storage pool loading condition must equal or exceed 1.50. 1.50. The same threshold a TVA engineer measured Dike C against and came up short on 30 years before. That leaves the men who moved it. The ash did not clean itself up. In February of 2009, TVA hired Jacobs Engineering to manage the cleanup. The work was done by subcontractors, and the men in the ash worked for them, not for Jacobs. From August of 2013, they sued, several hundred of them, across 10 consolidated cases. They said they had been exposed to what was in the ash, arsenic and mercury and lead and silica and radioactive material, and had not been allowed to protect themselves from it. Jacobs argued more than once that it could not be sued at all, that a contractor doing a federal agency's work stands inside that agency's immunity. TVA is wholly owned by the United States government, and that was the door. The trial was split. Phase 1 asked only whether Jacobs owed these men a duty, whether it broke that duty, and whether the breach was capable of causing what they were sick with. It was set for October of 2018 and ran 4 weeks. The jury said yes to all 3. Jacobs had violated its contract with TVA. It had failed to exercise reasonable care, and the breach was capable of causing each of 10 medical conditions. Phase 2. Whether the ash actually made any particular man sick, and what he was owed, never happened. In 2022, the Sixth Circuit affirmed that Jacobs had no derivative immunity and sent the case back. More than 13 years after the dike broke, the plaintiffs had established that they were allowed to sue. They settled the next year. The terms are confidential, so there is no public number. And because Phase 2 never ran, no court ever found that the ash caused any individual man's disease. But a public company has to tell its shareholders about its litigation. So the settlement does appear once in Jacobs' annual report to the Securities and Exchange Commission. The amount of the settlement was not material to the company's business, financial condition, results of operations, or cash flows. That is the last sentence anyone wrote about it. What is still buried is paperwork. The Parsons study, the Geosyntec peer review, and the 1985 memo are described in the Inspector General's report. None of the 3 is attached to it. We know what they said because a watchdog read them, and then the agency spent 6 months explaining there had been nothing to see. If you worked at Kingston or hauled for the cleanup or watched Swan Pond Road from your porch that winter, the comments are open and this channel reads them.